Hi, I'm your host, LA, and welcome to Inside Chat. This week, I'm speaking with Hintsa coach and performance strategist, Pete McKnight, and also performance coach, John Noonan. Welcome to Inside Chat, Pete and John, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. It's really great to be able to join you.
And how are you both? You okay there, John?
Very good. Yeah, thanks for having me along. Yeah, really looking forward to having a chat.
Oh, perfect. Well, Pete, first of all, tell us a little bit about Hintsa and the company's role in Formula 2.
So Hintsa was started by a Finnish orthopedic surgeon called Aki Hintsa, who started working with Mika Hakkinen in the 1990s. And basically his support to Mika in F1 began to expand, and he started working in McLaren and then Red Bull, and his work expanded and expanded to the point where he really needed to take on more coaches. And so he brought in a handful of coaches who were supporting some F1 drivers. And then I joined Hintsa in 2015 when there was kind of a handful of coaches working, supporting drivers. There was a medical director called Luke Bennett, who's still involved. And the vision was to really expand the company and bring in more coaches. And since that time, we've grown across F1, F2, F3, Formula E, World Rally, and a few other areas and sports. To the point where we're kind of this trusted services company that provide sports science and medical services to top level athletes. And so over the last few years, we've had a lot of F2 drivers that we've supported, and that can be from a physical point of view, a psychological point of view, just helping them, anything on the human side that's not to do with the driving, anything that's the human performance side, then we're brought in to optimize that, look after these guys, help them grow and develop, because a lot of them are young drivers on a journey to try get to F1 or to other series of motorsports. So we're there to really help them develop and support them.
So does Hintsa provide a basic model for a driver training program, and then it's personalized for the individual driver?
Yeah, so we offer a whole array of services. And so we would sell a package that would involve medical cover, expert nutrition advice, input from physiotherapy if needed, sports psychology, but all that would be coordinated by a performance coach, somebody like John, who comes with loads of experience in high performance sport, whether that's Winter Olympic sport, professional rugby, professional football, and lots of other sports that John's been involved in, and research as well, and so on. So we bring in a performance expert like John, who would basically be the athlete's performance coach, who would then coordinate all the services that driver needs. So if that driver needs training, John would deliver that. If they need any kind of nutrition, psychology support, John would deliver that up to a point. But then if he would see the need for an intervention, he would bring in a top level sports psychologist and work with them, or bring in a top level nutritionist and work with them. But on a day-to-day basis, the performance coach would kind of deliver everything and manage the program and look after every area of human support for that driver.
Well, that's a really good opportunity to bring you in, John, and just ask you a little bit about your background, and then how how that benefits you to be a performance coach for a racing driver.
For sure, there's no university degree that says come and be a performance coach for a racing driver. There's no degree for that. So it really is honestly an amalgamation of the experiences, and the sports that Pete mentions as certainly the sports that I've probably got the most experience with. But working in performance sport or high performance sport for the last 13, 14 years, you see what works in a number of high level organizations, and you kind of take the best bits of your methods, your philosophies, and you package it with what you see in front of you as well. So like with any sport, really, you're doing a bit of a needs analysis on what are the primary objectives of the team, of the driver, of the whole package. And where can you enable them to be better at what they currently do and utilize certain tools like Pete was mentioning before, be that the physical activity, the medical nutrition, etc., to enable a better performance. But for me, yeah, it's kind of been a lifelong journey, really, of kind of a few degrees in different sports, which amalgamate you to a point where you've got a number of skills in many different areas. But as Pete said, the great thing about what we try and do really is have a number of key experts around us. So on the ground, I might be the eyes and the ears, but have this great capacity to tap into experts who are doctors and leaders in their field ultimately as well, and bring them in as we see fit.
Yeah, and obviously I guess that's why they say there's a science behind it, because it isn't just a physical training program like you'd find down at your local gym. This, as you've just explained, it's like a collaboration of experts, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And I've worked at the gym face as well, and there's some great practice being delivered there. But I think one of the great things absolutely is that operating at this level, where the margins mean the difference between a podium and maybe crashing, is that we want to make sure that, yes, there is a science, there's a strategy to what we're doing. And it's, by and large, it's led by the driver as well. I think that's quite important to say. It's not us necessarily telling them what to do, how to do it, when to do it, because these guys are very autonomous in nature anyway. They make high level decisions in a split of a moment that they have to be accountable for. So we're very much about trying to collaborate in the best possible manner with these guys and the teams to ensure that everyone is feeling supported, and it's a massive collaborative process.
So can you tell us then a little bit more about the driver's nutritional program and maybe some psychological training that may be involved?
From a nutrition point of view, like every asset that we have, we'll do a needs analysis for the driver, and that's very much dependent upon our knowledge of the sport as well. So what are the physical demands typically that we need to fuel you for prior to driving, during racing or driving itself, and then afterwards? And we want to understand exactly where a driver is at that point in time based on their age, their experience, their training history comes into that too. Body composition, which obviously is quite an important feature for racing drivers as well, with a weight management or weight restriction, I should say, being in place in a lot of the seats. So we want to ensure that a driver, whilst they have maybe historically habits and preferences, that a lot of those things are considered, but at the same time, we're making some pretty strong assessments on, okay, where are you now with where you'd like to be from an all-round point of view, as well as physical as well as nutritional, and what are the steps that we need to take you there? So it's very much a long-term process as well. But in essence, a lot of it is really governed by the demands of the sport, the body composition requirements. Do they need to put on weight? Do they need to lose a bit of weight? Where do we have some affordances with maybe losing a kilogram or two, if that's a need for an individual, such as one of the guys I was working with recently, because an engineer would look at that situation. So, if you can give me an extra couple of kilograms to play with, then we can place this weight in the car, and that may give us an advantage in balance of the car and how that may perform. So you're kind of parrying your recommendations with that in mind as well. But one thing to say, I guess, too, is that a lot of these guys have their own superpowers, really. So some of them have had coaches in the past. Some of them already had a really good handle on nutrition. So you're kind of trying to meet the driver with where they are based on their experience, and then add some extra value on top of that. And in some instances, they're already doing a great job. And then our strategies are less about away from the track and then more about on the track, like what we do to fuel them there. So, there's no secrets here really, but there's a large part of their demand is going to be fueled by carbohydrates. That's a readily accessible fuel that these guys need to perform at really high level. We know that if the body is starved of that fuel source, that it can have impacts from a cognitive point of view, so how quickly they can react and make high level decisions at the wheel. So we want to make sure that they're really fueled there. And clearly afterwards, we want to make sure that they're very refueled as well for, the episodes between events on the same day and then back-to-back days. So you have kind of strategies on the track, you have strategies away from the track, but both of those things are really detailed by the sport and the needs, and then the body composition requirements of the individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, because that was going to be something that I asked you about, the way there's a possibility that they can train their bodies to store glucose in their liver and their muscles, and there's methods for them to control their adrenaline levels for the race start and then to get to the end of the race. And I kind of I'd really like to sort of talk more about that as well, if that's okay, from those two different points of view, really. So yeah, the control of the adrenaline levels, which would be great to talk about.
Yeah, sure. So Well, I mean, from a fueling point of view, we're trying to think about fueling for the work required. So if we know that a driver has a stint in the car, which is, say, in a free practice session, 45 minutes versus an hour race, of course, used to be the format last year, that we'll want to make sure that those energy requirements are being met. And usually the approach to fueling in that way would not just be in the 2 hours prior to the race itself or the drive. It would be 24 to 40 hours prior to. So on the eve of a day like that, we'd be fueling already to make sure that there's a sufficient reservoir, if you will, of energy available for them to call upon. So you're right, there's energy in the liver and there's energy readily available in the muscles that they can quickly access and use. We understand, of course, that if there isn't good carbohydrate availability, that is a stress in terms of heat management as well. And of course, then heat in itself is another factor that we have to consider and try and manage and mitigate with, if you will, at the moment where, the temperature in Europe is hotting up. So where these guys are in France now, it's certainly hotting up, and higher levels of carbohydrate availability are incredibly important there. And really it's that the cost is, if we don't have those things in place, then the sacrifice is that we lose, say, reaction time, or we lose the ability to combat fatigue. But the driver that we're really after here is looking at what are the key outcomes that we want to see. So do we have enough energy available? Have you trained in the right manner that enables you to be mentally able to do that job under those conditions, in that environment, with this stress upon you? So it plays a much larger factor as well. I mean, in terms of managing cortisol and things like adrenaline as well, we have lots of conversations with these guys, as Pete alluded to, psychologically, about where their preferences are going to be, mental preferences are going to be, and how they approach certain situations. So if these guys feel overwrought, highly stressed, and they feel like they're really wrestling with some adversity, then of course we understand adrenaline will be much, much higher. So there's factors there to consider too within the conversations that we have and the priming strategies that we would use to help these guys get in the right place mentally to address that fear or address that pressure, because all these guys are masters really of handling fear, at least the top level guys are. So, that's also a factor within our psychological program. But in essence, to combat, situations where they feel like adrenaline is too excessive, yeah, of course, carbohydrate availability is quite important. I mean, in instance as well, adrenaline is quite important, and it's also a hormone that you don't want to suppress too much, because that's the fight and flight hormone that we want to help these guys control. There's never going to be a situation where it isn't there, but I guess it's about making sure that there isn't a situation where they're overwrought with a point where they can't cope with the feelings and emotions that are taking place and driven by the adrenaline at the same time. So yeah, it's kind of all encompassing, really.
If I could kind of add to what John said, so with things like adrenaline and like hormonal control, there's a lot, like John said, around the psychological side, and what we don't want is that they get really, really worked up beforehand, either with fear or just feeling really pumped and up for it, and then have a crash in their kind of state, not a physical crash into the wall, but a crash in their state before the race, because then they're going into the race at a real low. So it's all about managing their emotions, managing their thoughts. And for a young driver, this is a maturity process. It's finding routines that will help them get to the right level of readiness or arousal to go into the car and be able to perform at a really high level, but not to be overly stimulated where you could then actually crash and put the car into the wall, but that you're under control, but that you're kind of stimulated enough that you're not kind of just going for a Sunday drive and not taking it seriously. So in the lead up, it's really important that they don't get overexcited and over emotional and start thinking and over analyzing and everything, that they come in absolutely drained, but having the right routines in place that would build them up and get them ready to the right level. And the only way you can really do that is knowing your driver and having a relationship with your driver. And that's one of the things that we've found, is that our coaches get very, very close to their drivers, and they build a real understanding of what they need, how they respond before and after races, how they respond to victory, how they respond to loss, how they respond to adversity, how they respond to challenge, how they respond to all sorts of things. And there's even like all sorts of subtleties, like you don't want to add expose them to stress leading up to a race. So you don't want them taking a phone call like half an hour before a race where their mum's on the line saying, oh, there's all these family issues at home, or they're just doing life admin, or they get an email about an electricity bill that they need to pay, or they're on Instagram and they see a negative comment on a post. We need to kind of get their phones off them, take away all distractions from family, from home life, from social media, and just help them get focused and get into a routine that's going to prepare them to perform in the race that's coming up. So there's just so many kind of moving parts to juggle, and the performance coach knows the driver so well, they can manage all these different situations.
If I can just go back a little bit on something that you mentioned, John, about the sessions, having back-to-back sessions. And for Formula 2, we've now obviously just had the extra sprint race introduced. How has their programme changed to accommodate that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess from the outlook, you would think that in itself is a quite a difficult scenario to manage. But the reality is that these guys are pretty skilled at doing that already. I mean, the format already the day prior, where they do the free practice into the qualifying, is again already a situation that they're probably all very well versed with. They've done it for at least a year or two. I mean, the guys, if they've come from Formula 3, they've done it there as well. And the reality is that the preparation and the process that they go through is pretty similar, despite the fact that it's a race. I guess the real difference, obviously, is that they're trying to win in both sessions or place as high as they can in both sessions. So really for us, I mean, if we were to highlight the key areas that we want to be addressing most, or supporting the driver in the most to be the best that they can be in those sessions, is psychologically, as Pete mentioned already, with the conversations prior then afterwards. We want to ensure that from a fueling point of view, they've got enough fuel coming in and out of each session. From a heat management point of view, we want to make sure that, you alluded to yourself there, that they're starting to cool immediately as they get out of the car if they can. So we can try and bring their core temperature back to a more ideal homeostasis so they're not overheated, because that in itself means that they can't feedback the information to the engineers about what's going to be important for the next session. They may struggle to manage sort of emotional processing a little bit. So these guys will feel quite stressed and a little bit, like they've just been through 10 rounds of Mike Tyson after a race, and they will need to be able to cool down and collect their thoughts and then trick back into, right, next session, next thought. So we're trying to support them in the process where they're not dwelling too much on the session that's just occurred, and that they're getting ready for the session to come. But, in terms of the more kind of fundamental approach to that, is that we have our fueling approach in the hours before. We want to make sure, obviously, that we're warming them up, so to speak, but not too much from a core temperature point of view. And that's quite an interesting area, that the warm up in itself by term means that you are trying to put some heat in the body, some heat in the tissues that are going to be used. You're preparing the body for the work to come, but we don't want a point which is too high in terms of increasing too much heat, because that means that they become overheated the minute that they get in the car, because they're sat behind or in front of a hot engine and everything else. So that's all coming into play as well. So we'll just do enough of a preparation session, preparing things like their arms, their shoulder girdles, their neck for the forces to come, making sure that they feel good in their body and they feel right in their mind, and then they'll go into the session. So, really you'll see coaches like myself come into the grid with 1 or 2 water and electrolytes. So maybe some last minute bits of energy that we're going to put in them, say half an hour before. In our warm-up bags, we'll have little tools. That might be, some guys like to skip, it's each to their own. Other guys like to do mobility. Then most, for the main part, might all like to do some sort of reaction stuff. But some of the guys you'll see do like the blaze pods, I think they're called, where they'll tap little buttons, and others will do more tennis ball nature varied activities. So they've all got their little quirks. Like Pete said, it's really down to the preference of the individual, and we'll do that roughly for maybe 10 or 15 minutes prior to getting in the car. But yeah, for sure, the key priority when they get out of the car is to give them a little bit of space just to download some of the thoughts, calm themselves down. They'll download some of those thoughts immediately into what they've got with their track notes or their their kind of like an evaluation report they'll get from the engineer, and then we'll look to come in a little bit more and have some conversations with them and see how we can support them best with finishing that chapter that's just happened and how we can prepare for the next one. But there's kind of always this montage of managing heats, ensuring they're well fueled, and ensuring that mentally they're in a really good place.
Yeah, I'm led to believe that even the choice in maybe colour of undergarments can make a factor, whether they be very light being white or dark being black, could also maybe have a difference in their core temperature. Is that right?
Oh, I think there's maybe an element of that for sure. I mean, so in managing core temperature, you're looking at internally how hot is the system getting versus the skin temperature, which is more peripheral heat. So if we're really going to affect heat and heat management, it's more the core temperature that we're interested in. And really, you can only do that by submerging a body in a really cold environment. So, you'll see sometimes on social media, these guys dropping into plunge pools and they're trying to cool their system down before they jump in the car. And that's certainly an advantage, and that's well researched. Other preferences, yeah, for sure, is that these guys like a white versus a darker garment. I think it's common sense, it's logic that tells us that darker objects hold more heat than white objects. But again, the garments that these guys wear are all designed with that in mind, and obviously with fire safety, preventative risks in mind as well. So, but I think some of that may be psychological with their preferences too. But yeah, it's certainly a factor.
Yeah. So are these drivers for Formula 2 already a Formula 1 standard regarding fitness? Because when you have drivers that go into the practice sessions for Formula 1 teams, or last year, for example, Jack Aitken jumped into that Williams for the Sakir Grand Prix. Regarding braking differences in a Formula 1 car, G-force difference, are the Formula 2 drivers prepared for that? And that can be for either or both of you, really.
Maybe I'll start and just say something about kind of the culture of training, and then John can touch on kind of the fitness elements of the drivers. But I think there's been a massive cultural shift in the last sort of 5 to 10 years in motor racing, motorsports, and that's kind of trickled down from Formula 1, where there's now this culture that every driver has a performance coach. And, the stakes are so high now in Formula 1 that you can't leave any stone unturned. So you can't get away with being unfit because somebody else will take your seat, and so the culture has kind of evolved and developed. So these guys are getting fitter and fitter, which is helping them recover better between races. It's helping them travel better. It's helping them be more at ease and relaxed in the car, because we know that driving pushes up your heart rate. So the fitter you are, the more you'll cope with that. So there's lots and lots of reasons why being fitter is better, and that's then had a trickle down effect into F2, F3, and other series of motorsports. So we have seen that drivers are getting fitter, and young drivers are now taking their fitness seriously. And a lot of young drivers in F2 will have performance coaches and will be putting a big emphasis on their fitness. So maybe, John, you can touch a bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of witnessed cultural shift, and it was a very similar shift, by the way, that I saw in Olympic winter sport within the freestyle snow sports, that the best in the field were seen very regularly to be preparing, if you like, for their sport through regular exercise, strength training, mobility, recovery, and that's seen as certainly from younger, more impressional men and women to be an area that clearly maybe I want to focus on that. And it's the same things that we see all the time with our children who want to emulate these football guys that they see on TV. It's a natural driver and a shift in behavior, and it's a needed one, quite frankly, as well. I mean, I think there is a bit of a cultural knowledge that the cars clearly do have a large factor in performance as well, and that there are some cars that perform better than others, perhaps. But needless to say as well, that the individual, the human behind that wheel, clearly has a massive influence on it as well. And I think from a fitness point of view, there's definitely a standard or a level which is required ultimately, because if they're not able to cash the checks physically, then they clearly can't perform at that level, that exceptional high level, for hours on end in an F1 car. week after week, season after season. So that those stresses are well known. And not to mention the other factors with regular travel, jet lag, and managing those sort of influences too. They're really important, and it all really stems back to: do you fundamentally have the key physical requisites to do that job? Can you compete at that level? So, fundamentally, like you mentioned it before, but if the F1 cars already hit bigger peak speeds, then they're going to be hitting bigger peak Gs. And the strain that it has, say, on the neck, for instance, then yes, there is a known quantity that is much harder in an F1 car. But actually, and quite positively, the performances that I've seen, or the capacities that we've assessed of the F2 guys, that they're pretty close. And some of them, if not exceed, some of the F1 guys, because with less races in the season, it affords them more opportunities to train and physically improve certain attributes. So they're kind of a bit more affordance on time to get physically in the right place to perform when asked to get in an F1 car. And I think by and large, and even the F1 guys will say after a really good long pre-season, their first or second stint in the car, they're usually getting out, and they're all saying that I have some quite specific neck stiffness or soreness, because that experience is so unique, and how they reach these peak forces in the neck at the speeds that they do because of the nature of the car that they're driving. It's so different to an F2 car in that instance. So there's certainly a period where they have to adapt, but for the main, they're not too far off in terms of fitness, strength, and other athletic qualities for sure.
Now, just touching briefly on the off season, in comparison to when the season begins, there's obviously a lot of changes, even in their diet, their nutrition. Are the drivers still under a program for the off season as well?
Yeah, the general consensus is that if you have a pretty good off season, then physically you're prepared for the in season. That if you will is the grounding, the foundation for all physical things to come. And I've been in other sports where you have a really, really small off-season or pre-season, and how that can affect and hinder your ability to be at your best throughout the season. So the off-season really will start with a small period of downtime where we'll try and get them home to see, friends, family, and just take a load off from the long season that they've just been through. And that's quite important, I think, to reset things psychologically, if nothing else. And after a short window, they'll come in to some more formal training. And if there's certain instances where we can do it with an athlete, and we'll get into an environment with them and train with them if we live near them, for instance. And there's other instances with how COVID has permitted certain changes in working conditions that we'll do that online, and that is very achievable too. So yeah, for the main part, we'll have a program and a model that's looking very generally at a number of the key physical areas that contribute to being a world-class driver. And then the closer we get to racing, or the first race, the more specific our focus intensities will get into, or that specific nature of driving for a car, for sure. Yeah.
And then I think one of the things we also do is throw in, blocks of training camps as well. And so, that might be going over to Europe where a driver's based and spending a week with them doing a training camp. It might be heading off into the Alps and doing some cross-country skiing, or something, just to kind of mix it up a bit and throw in some challenges. So we run training camps with them as well, just to kind of mix it up a bit, but also to have an intense block where they can just get away from home, get away from distractions, and just focus on eating well, sleeping well, and training hard. And so yeah, John's got some good experiences of different camps in different parts of Europe as well. So yeah, they're always good fun.
Yeah, I guess different climates also kind of helps as well, for sure. Well, I would love to go on. There's so many more questions that I have, and so I'm kind of hoping that at some point we might be able to chat again, because there's many pending questions. But I can't thank you both enough, both Pete and John. Myself and our followers have gained an absolute fascinating insight into the training and conditioning the drivers have to adhere to cope with the demands of being a current racing driver. So, I do wish you both well, and it was absolutely wonderful to have you on Inside Chat, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having us. It's been a real privilege to be able to join you.
And I'd like to thank you too for watching Inside Chat. I'll see you next time.